Hello, so welcome to this latest episode of Creating a Buzz About Health with me, Paula Carnell. And by popular demand, I am speaking again about wasps. Now, I did an episode a couple of years ago about wasps and how I believe they are the rubbish collectors of nature. However, I've had more insights over the last couple of years and I wanted to share a bit more. So we are in the end of July here in the UK, so in the middle of our summer, and yet this is the time of year when we want to be outside, we want to be having our barbecues, having our drinks outside, and we have wasps. We have the wasps coming in and really sort of upsetting us. They're after our drinks, they're buzzing around. Now, if you're a beekeeper, there's the extra layer that you have the wasps, and there is this perception that the wasps attack bees and that they will destroy colonies. And this is something that I really want to address. And I too used to believe this. And many years ago, or several years ago, I was setting up bees and I had a small apiary for a client, and there was a team of us beekeepers that were looking after these bees. And I was very much learning and observing, and one of my team members had been a beekeeper for over 40 years, so he was really, really experienced. And we were practicing the asking the bees how much honey we can take. So before we would ask, I would go and check the apiary and I'd just observe, spend time watching the bees. And traditionally, people harvest their honey July and August. It's the end, towards the end of the summer, the nectar flows. It's when the hive is going to have the most honey. And so the plan is that you harvest. And I was watching the hives, and there were 4 WBC hives. So these are the traditional English hives that have the outer boxes on them. So they've got this extra insulation and they have this lovely landing board above the legs. So they're stood up above the ground. And I could see the bees, they were flying in and out, but they were also on the landing board. And I was familiar with watching the bees cleaning the landing board. So they do this sort of rocking movement and they're sort of cleaning it up on the front. But what I noticed this particular time, so I'd gone there pre-harvest to talk to the bees and to ask how much honey we could have. And I was looking at each hive and I noticed the bees were grooming each other. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And there wasn't too much of coming in with pollen or nectar. They were literally chilling out. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. The bees are just relaxing and they're grooming. They were really taking care to groom each bee as it came into the hive. So I thought, well, this is interesting. So out of the 4 colonies, there were 3 that we decided to take honey from. And so I would sit with one colony, and my bee team, they would have their favorite bees and they would sit with the colony too. And we would just meditate in our heads and just say, hello, bees, it's time for rent day. We're going to come back next week, possibly Tuesday, and we'll take some honey. We'd like to take some honey. How much can we have? Now, conventional beekeepers and most beekeepers will take a whole box. So you have these boxes called supers, which are half the depth of the brood, and that's where the bees store the honey. So the idea is you take all of those, and then the hive is smaller for the winter, and then sugar would be added to feed the bees through the winter. Or there'd be an assumption that they would have enough honey in the brood box, or maybe you would leave 1 super and take 2 if there were 3 supers on there. Now, I would ask how much honey in frames, and each box had 10 frames. So I would have this feeling of a number of maybe 6 or maybe 13 or 24. All depends on the size of the hive. But what I did find interesting was there wasn't a relationship really. You couldn't directly guess from the amount of full supers. 2 hives could both have 3 supers, but one hive might say, oh, you can have 6 frames, and the other hive might say you can have 20. So we really honoured whatever we felt the bees were saying. And so we went back on the agreed time and date. So the bees were prepared, they knew we were coming back, and we'd take the honey. Now, because we were harvesting end of July, August, there were wasps around. So we'd be really careful not to drip any honey But the whole process of harvesting honey, you're opening the hive, so you're breaking the propolis seal that the bees have put around each box, and you're taking the honey. And we would take off the supers, we'd pull out only the frames that were fully capped with honey, put them in a box, and then we would have our honey harvest, put the hive back together again. So we did this and we honoured what the bees had said they wanted. But there was one colony that I didn't touch, didn't take any honey from. When I went back a few days later, so the same day we'd harvested the honey, and then we replaced what's called the stickies. So these are the frames where you'd spun out the honey, but there's still a bit of honey in there. So you put the empty frames back in the hive so the bees can clean it up. So we did all this. And then I observed the hives, and what I noticed was the hives we took honey from were no longer grooming outside the hive. They had their entrances fully wide open, and they were just all flying. They were all going out and collecting and bringing in as much nectar as they could, no matter how much honey we'd taken. The hive we hadn't taken honey from was still really chilled out and grooming, and this really shocked me. Because I thought, oh my gosh, there's a change of behaviour. You know, the bees that we'd taken the honey from were now in a sort of anxious state of just going out and thinking, oh, we've lost some honey, we've got to refill it. And you're talking July, August, when maybe there's still clover. It might be the first signs of ivy blossom, and there could well be brambles. So that is what the bees were having to harvest in. And we would have taken off the dandelion, the lime tree, any other garden harvest, you know, that was in the hives. But then what happened was really worrying. The wasps came in. So the wasps started attacking the hives. And what the wasps would do is they would come to the entrance and they would try and sneak in. And the bees would guard the entrance. And what they would try and do is just stop a wasp coming in. Because the problem is that when a wasp gets into a hive, it picks up the pheromone of the hive, and then they become invisible and they can just help themselves to the honey. And this can really deplete a colony. And the more wasps that get in, the more wasps you've got taking out the nectar, and it just finishes off a hive. And we actually lost at least one of those colonies, and I think we lost another colony in the same apiary that we hadn't taken honey from, but the wasps were attacking them. So now let's look at what's happening in the wasp world. So during the spring, the female queen wasp, she emerges and she starts to build a nest. And after a few weeks, the first wasps emerge. And what they do is they collect, when they emerge and they're able to fly, they then support the queen with collecting nectar and pollen. So the pollen is protein and the nectar is carbohydrate, to bring back to feed the growing larvae. Now, where wasps are different to bees, bees are vegetarian or vegan. So whereas wasps are carnivores, so they will eat meat. So they'll eat rotting anything and bring it back, feed it to the larvae. Now, this is the thing. The adult wasps can only digest food that's already been pre-digested by the larvae. So these adult wasps are going out, collecting whatever they can, bringing it back to the nest, feeding the larvae process it, the adult wasps feed whatever comes out the other end, and that's what they live on. Now, you get to July and August, and the queen wasp, she's built up her nest. It's a big successful organism. They've all been going out, you know, collecting nectar and pollen and cleaning up the environment, because they are the rubbish collectors of nature. So they'll be cleaning up any kind of rotting anything, bringing it back. But now the queen says, right, I've laid next year's queens or this year's queens for next year's season. I don't need to lay any more eggs. And so there's no more larvae. And then what happens is these adult wasps can't digest any of the food. The only food they can digest is pure sugars. So this is why you will see wasps on your fruit juices, on your fizzy drinks, anything that's glucose or pure sugar, and particularly honey. So the harvest is coinciding. We're harvesting honey the same time that the wasps are kicked out of their nests with no access to the larder. And so the honey is the pure food that they want to get. So you have this perfect storm. And then going back to the beehives, you have bees who have spent all spring and summer collecting nectar and storing it, turning it into honey, storing it in their hives, ready to get them through the winter. And suddenly a portion of it has gone. And so the bees are thinking, okay, we don't know how long the winter's going to be. We've just got to be all hands on deck and just keep filling up our empty spaces, because we'd returned the empty frames. So the bees are going out there, they're bringing it all in. So the entrances are wide. Whereas the colonies we hadn't taken honey from, they'd sealed up their entrances with propolis. They were relaxing, they had a few guard bees, but the key thing was, because the hive hadn't been opened, the propolis seals hadn't been broken. So there was no aroma of honey coming out from those hives. And so the wasps were almost oblivious that there was a beehive there full of honey, because the bees were able to protect themselves. So that year, when we lost colonies because of wasps, but also because I'd observed the pattern of the bees, I changed my beekeeping practices. And that's when I started to think, okay, how can I work with nature instead of against nature? And if you have wasp traps, if you put it next to the hive, next to your beehive, are you attracting more wasps to the area? If you put it too far away, does it not benefit your bees? It's a nightmare. Wherever you put the wasps, you kill lots of wasps, you kill lots of other insects, and your bees still struggle. So what I decided to do was bring forward my harvesting of honey. Instead of opening the hive when the wasps are active and hungry, I open the hive before the wasps are around. And this seems to happen or their wasps seem to come about just after midsummer. So I set myself a goal each year that I'll do my harvesting by midsummer. And some years it's difficult. This year it's difficult because it was so cold in April and May. The bees were building up their stores, but it was really, really cold. So I only had a short amount of time in June to harvest the honey. It also means that I may not get the lime tree honey or the clover honey in my harvest. However, because I take the honey early, I return the stickies. I don't use queen excluders, by the way, so my hives are completely open so the bees can move freely around. But then what happens is that my bees go into winter with 3 or 4 supers on. And although I've taken some honey at the beginning of summer or midsummer, they've got all this space to fill, and they've got the time of July before the wasps get busy to fill it up. So they have the lime tree, they have the clover, they have what other wildflowers around. They can fill up the hive. So by July and August, what they've also done is they've sealed up the box with propolis. So there's no aromas leaking out. The hive is secure. And I'm finding then that by the time you get to August, the bees are chilled, they're just grooming themselves, and they're really, ready for winter. But the other thing that happens is my bees go into winter with 3 or 4 supers on, and people say, oh, they can't keep it warm. But because they don't have a queen excluder, the cluster can move around the hive. So what I will find, if I use infrared cameras and actually see where the cluster is during the winter, I can see that the cluster has moved up the boxes. And quite often in February and March, my colony will be in the top super. So the queen will be there, and yes, she will lay eggs in super frames in the top box. But what is good is when you start to get the dandelions in April, and like this year, it's still too cold to lift the lid off your hive or to open the hive, the bees have got space. So what they do is they start filling up that top box around the cluster with the dandelion nectar, and then the queen will move down. She starts to move down, so that by the time I can open the hive in May, the queen is back down in the brood box. And yes, there will be some combs in the top box that would have had brood in, but I don't harvest by the box, I harvest by the frame. And I will take out those empty or old brood frames that are super, and I'll melt that wax down, and then I'll replace it with fresh frames that the bees can build fresh comb in. So it's changing the circle, and I still may get lime tree honey, because if the bees hadn't eaten it through the winter, it'll be there for my harvest in May or June. So that's what I do. Now, getting back to wasps. So you have the wasps, the adult wasps that are now starving. in nature, they're sort of surplus to requirements. The goal of the wasp, the queen wasp, is to build up a colony that will be stable enough and strong enough to feed the new queens. And I don't know the exact numbers of how many queens that a wasp nest will provide, but if you bear in mind that bumblebee nests used to, which would only have a colony of 200, they used to produce 33 queens on average, then I would imagine that a wasp nest for survival, also on the amount of queen wasps we found hibernating around our property through each winter, I would say each wasp nest would produce probably 20 plus queens. So once she's produced those queens and they've gone out and mated, that nest is no longer needed. And that's why she stops laying any more eggs, because her role has been achieved. So those queens have gone off and mated, and then they will find somewhere to hibernate. So all the adult wasps that are left, they're not needed. So yes, they do a bit of pollination when they're collecting nectar, if they can, from any flowers, but in nature they would die out. So that made me feel less bad, I suppose, about having wasp traps which would attract the wasps in, and they would trample each other as they try and get out and drown in like a sugar syrup or a jam syrup. So I didn't feel so bad. But this year I've learned some other tips about wasps, because I did have problems where I had a small hive, a small colony, a small swarm that were really struggling. I hadn't taken honey from them or anything. They were just in a small hive, and I could see they were being attacked by wasps. The wasps could get in, the bees couldn't defend themselves, and it was carnage. But this was a small colony that wasn't going to make it through the winter. And so we look at wasps then as the rubbish collectors of nature. Those bees, they didn't have any obvious signs of disease, but they weren't strong bees. And so the wasp took them out, just took them out of the whole DNA of this environment. They were no longer around. But then that did mean that they wanted to clean up that whole hive, and I wanted to put another colony of bees, another swarm into that hive. So I was told about just spraying washing up liquid. And I don't use a strong washing up liquid. I have a completely organic, green, healthy, bio washing up liquid. So I wasn't sure if it was going to be as effective. But if you put it in a water sprayer and you actually spray, what it does is it suffocates the wasps. So I know this isn't very nice, but there are occasions when you don't want these lost, dizzy, crazy adult wasps hanging around. And so a spray of the washing up liquid is quite effective. The other better thing that I heard, so if you have a problem where you have a wasp nest somewhere that you really don't want it, so in your home, for instance, or in a shed that you're going into, and every time you try and go in there, you're getting covered in wasps, then my South African friend, Kathleen, she shared that what they used to do was spray boiling water onto the nest. And what that does is it breaks down the paper of the nest and the wasps move on. So I thought that was a really great, not as disastrous, not as chemically toxic, or definitely not as chemically toxic as some of the other ways of removing wasp nests. Well, then the next thing that I wanted to talk about is, what is the message from wasps? If I'm a spiritual beekeeper and I'm very aware of the spirituality of bees and the spirituality of trees and the land and everything in our environment, then wasps must have a role in this. And if we look at wasps as the rubbish collectors of nature, they are really, really vital for cleaning up anything that can't be cleaned up by anything else. So there's something about the wasps, because they're carnivores, they can eat diseased bees, they can eat sick insects, and they just process them to make them safe again. So they have a really, really important role. So we don't want to be killing all the wasps. We don't want to be wiping them out, because every species that we wipe out is connected to another 7. And if we didn't have the wasps, what would happen with diseased or sick or weak colonies of honeybees, who would clean them up? So then I started to realise I'd been keeping on top of my colonies, and I replace the colony that had been cleaned up by the wasps. And then I found I had an awful lot of wasps going into my bee equipment shed. And I had set up that shed last year. I'd moved my business to the shed and to this bee spa last year, and the shed was really the safe place to put things that I could deal with later. So there was lots of boxes, lots of hidden shelves, lots of things buried in there, but I also kept my old supers and old wax combs and frames. And it has 3 little glass windows, and as with shed windows, one of the glass panes had slipped a bit, which meant that when the sun came through the window and warmed up the shed, there were a few frames with wax comb on, and they were frames that I'd harvested later last year, and decided that I would melt down those wax frames because I didn't want to open the hive again because the wasps had become active. And so I just stored them in a super and then forgot about them. And so they still had honey in. Now, because they were sort of sticky and they just had the honey in, the wasps could smell it, which was all right while the shed was sealed and the door was shut and the window was sealed. But once the window dropped and the sun was coming in and warming up, the aroma of that honey, the just tiny minuscule bits of honey on the wax frames, was just drawing in the wasps. Now, the added thing is that I hadn't set up my wax melter, and so I didn't have the wax melter set up to move the frames in anyway. That was another job, which I have now done, and that's working really brilliantly. So my shed was full of wasps, and I sealed up the window. So I put a mesh on the outside and I blocked it up on the inside. So I had to go into my shed wearing a full bee suit because it was just full of wasps. And then it occurred to me that, oh my gosh, what if a queen wasp had been hibernating in my bee shed all winter and now had built a nest? So it meant during these really hot temperatures that we've had, would have been perfect today where it's not so warm, but during the really hot summer, I had to put on my bee suit, get up really early in the morning and completely empty my shed, which was one of those jobs that really needed doing. And when we think about wasps, we think of them as the shadow self. You know, the bees are all loved. Even if they sting us, people still love the bees, want to save the bees. The wasps, everybody hates them, they're evil, we want to get rid of them. They don't get the love, but they still have a really significant role in our world. So what are they showing us? And what I came to see is they're showing us the shadow sides, they're showing us the secret sides. And as we're at a time where everything is gaining more light, everything is being exposed, everything is being revealed, the dark secrets of my shed had to be revealed, and that's what the wasps were telling me. So I had to empty everything out, went out all over the garden, and then I had to sort it out. I had to make sure that before I could do this, that my wax melter was sorted so I could put the offending frames covered in wasps, I could actually put them in the wax melter, which I did. And I went right through the shed, prepared to find a wasp nest that I could spray with hot water. There was no wasp nest. My little frames with a little bit of honey in through this open window had attracted wasps from goodness knows where, and they were all coming into my shed. The moment I cleaned out my shed and put away any wax, and there was no honey, everything was sealed, everything was tidy, which was one of those jobs that really needed doing anyway, the wasps were no longer a problem. So if you're having a problem with wasps in your house, in your garden, in your environment, with your bees, have a look at what is the shadow. What is it that they could be revealing to you that you've been secretly hiding? And of course, I was ashamed that I had a messy shed. I didn't want anyone to look in my bee shed. I should have a nice, tidy, organised shed. And now I do, and I want to show everybody. But the wasps really made me see what was hiding, what was needing to be dealt with, what rubbish needed clearing out. So if you're being faced with wasps and feeling that you're being attacked by them, have a look at what's going on in your life, what rubbish needs collecting, what illness needs clearing up, cleaning up, what debris has to go, and let the wasps do their work. And if they're doing their work and it's it's benefiting your outer environment, it's also going to impact your inner environment. And as I do believe that everything in our outer environment is a reflection of our inner environment too. So if we can find the inner peace, that will radiate out, and we will then be living in an environment of peace and calm. So the wasps have such an important role to play. And if they're triggering you for whatever reason, have a look at why. So I hope this has been helpful. So if you want to have more great conversations about triggering things like wasps or different ways of looking after your bees, I have got my community on school spiritual beekeeping. The link is in the notes here. So you can just go to any of my social medias and just tap the link, or go to school, and which is SKOOL, and just look up spiritual beekeeping. And I will see you in there. So thanks very much, and until next time, let's all keep creating a buzz about health. And a huge thank you to those of you who've watched this live, my first live podcast. So thanks very much. Bye for now.